David Brown. I am a freelance writer and author, and I've been doing this for 15 years. I work for myself. The work that I write, or the things that I write, are each piece is actually on contract, and of course, books are done by contracts as well. I come up with the ideas and things that I think would be interesting, and things that I think readers would like, and editors would like, and things that fit the publications that I'm writing for. And the first step is to sort of come up with a pitch that sort of encapsulates everything that I would hope to convey in an article and research and report on. And that goes to an editor at a publication, whether it's a magazine or newspaper or website, or in the case of books, to a book publisher. And the editors sort of have the final word on that. So a freelance writer is just someone who works for themselves. I don't get health insurance from any particular publication or anything like that. An author, and these terms, or depending on who you speak with, are going to be used differently. I consider an author to be someone who it actually has published a book, and that's the majority of what I do. Freelance writing is an excellent way to sort of stay on top of, if you cover a particular genre or field in your books. I find that and doing freelance writing at the same time go very well together. They supplement each other, both financially, but also in terms of having contacts in the field, in terms of meeting new people, coming up with new ways to think about things. And one always tends to feed the other. But you can do one or the other and not both. This is just the path that I went down, and it's worked well for me so far. So for day-to-day stuff, just when I'm actually writing either chapters in a book or pieces, essays, or whatever to file to different publications, my job would look pretty boring. I tend to either work from home or work from a coffee shop. I would say I probably work from coffee shops 85% of the time. I'm in New Orleans, so it's really hot out there. So sometimes I just don't have the self discipline or strength to go out and face the sun and the humidity. But the cool thing about my job is that I can do it from anywhere. And I have done it from some pretty extreme places. And that's one of the rewarding parts of the job as well. When I'm actually reporting, I tend to write. So the things that I write about, and sort of my personal philosophy when it comes to journalism or creative nonfiction, certainly, is to get out there and actually know what the dirt tastes like in the place that you're writing about, to know how people talk and how people live and what people do. And you can read about these things, and you can watch videos about these things, and you can interview people by telephone or by Zoom, which when I first started, Zoom, of course, did not exist. But you can do those things, and you can get a lot of amazing material. But I think there's a certain something that you get by actually sitting with someone for long periods of time, letting them know who you are, and they revealing themselves in kind, sort of taking the armor off. It's very easy, like just in this conversation that you and I are having right now, like there's a certain level of armor that I'm wearing because I'm being interviewed. So it takes a long time before anyone you speak with becomes comfortable enough to reveal not necessarily facts, but certainly truth, I guess capital T sorts of truths about themselves and about what they do and the worlds that they inhabit. So an average day is at a coffee shop, or here sitting in Microsoft Word at my laptop. When I'm in the field, that could be some fun stuff. So the field might just be so I do a lot of work covering the space program. So I might be at a NASA center or a launch, or in one of those clean rooms where they build spacecraft. And that's pretty cool. It could be Antarctica, which I did, and which I will be doing again in January 2022 for for just over 2 months. So, and that's also one of the cool parts about my job, is that I can follow my interests and my passions. So when I was young, what did I like? I liked space and I liked robots. And as an adult, I decided, well, what do I like to do? Well, I guess I'll just write about space robots. And that worked out pretty well for me. And Antarctica is the same way. Like, why am I writing a book about Antarctica? Well, I have a lot of things to say about climate change, and I wanted to understand how these things happen. But also, I kind of just wanted to go. So when I first started my writing career, I actually wrote a novel, and I found it very rewarding. And later I would get a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, and my specialty in that program was fiction. So I have a deep fiction background, and I've published short stories and things like that over the years. I sort of stumbled into nonfiction early in my career, because fiction, unless you are fabulously successful, it can sometimes be hard to make money, which is something that is pretty useful if you want to pay your rent. So what I write is called creative nonfiction, and it's a relatively new genre in literature scales, not necessarily in lifetime scales. And that is writing nonfiction, but using the literary and narrative techniques from poetry and fiction and applying that to a nonfiction work in order to somehow tell the story either in an interesting way stylistically, or to sort of convey a message to readers in ways that they might not otherwise encounter. That's definitely my passion, and I've sort of gone all in on that. I think it's a tricky genre to write in. And of course, I do write very traditional stuff. So you're not going to find a lot of creative nonfiction in the New York Times, where I do write on occasion, or the Wall Street Journal or whatever. But you might find that in like the New Yorker, or certainly in my book. So I just had a book come out called The Mission. And the way that I tell that story, it's about a NASA mission that scientists spent 20 years trying to sort of get off the ground, and sort of the heartbreaks and setbacks they encountered along the way, and the highs and lows, and all the adventure and romance that you would expect in sort of an epic space mission that crosses generations. And that is nonfiction. And when I first approached the subject, there were two ways that I could have gone with that. I mean, certainly you could tell a very conventional nonfiction story. And then this happened, close quote, said Bob, who did whatever. I find it more engaging to actually be in their head, and for the book to read with sort of a thrilling sense of wonder, if that makes sense, to sort of be in their mind when they're doing these things. It's hard to write because it takes a long time. So The Mission took 7 years to write, which is way longer than my publishers hoped, I'm pretty sure. And although I hope they're not watching this right now, my next one will probably take a very long time as well. And the reason it takes so long is because, again, it's what I'd mentioned earlier. You've got to really get to know people, right? If you're going to be in their head and you're going to write authentically about their lives and about their experiences, then you can't do that in a 1 hour interview. You can't do it in a 3 hour interview, although that helps. I find that it might take 20 hours, 40 hours. I mean, there were hundreds. I spoke with hundreds of people for the last book, or 100 people for the last book, approximately, for, 1,000 hours. I mean, probably more than that cumulatively. And that's not counting sort of the research that goes into it, whether it's reading primary documents, letters that were exchanged at the time, or whether it's reading research and correspondence and the news articles that were written whenever people who were part of something important when they were actually working on those things. Yeah, it's very difficult. And the other sort of difficulty is particularly so it just so happens that the area that I write about has tended to involve scientists. I don't write science books, which are a whole different thing, and I have a great respect for people who can write that stuff. But my books tend to involve a lot of science. When but because I'm not writing for a scientific audience, I'm doing all the heavy lifting for the reader. When they pick up my book or any story that I write, you don't need to have taken physics in college. You don't need to know the difference between an asteroid and a black hole. I'm going to do the heavy lifting for you, but that also requires learning this stuff. And that's very difficult, particularly when you cover multidisciplinary fields like planetary science, or in the case of Antarctica, any science involving the cryosphere. Those can be tricky subjects. And you're talking to somebody who is, I'm no physicist, and I'm no glaciologist, or I'm none of those things. So it's very hard to make something read like it was easy to write. It's a lot harder to write that than it is to write something that's hard to write or hard to read. And I mean, there's a saying in computer science, right? I don't document my code. If it was hard for me to read, if it was hard for me to write, it should be hard for you to read. But I have, in this job, I have to make sure that it's very easy for you to read. So I have it's not like being an author is being an engineer where you have to get formal certifications. I mean, if you can hold a pen and own a notebook, you could get started with this job. And if you have a library card, you can reach any level of ability that you would devote yourself to. That said, I would highly encourage anyone interested in pursuing this field to probably get some formal education. If you're writing fiction, so I'll just sort of riff on this a little bit, because if you're writing fiction and you're 18 or 19, although there are exceptions to the rule and some extraordinary writers at that age, generally speaking, you don't really have a whole heck of a lot of life experience. So if you're going to write about the truth of human nature, and I'm not even talking about profound works of literary fiction. Even if you're going to write a Game of Thrones or Harry Potter or whatever, there are entire lived lives that went into those works, so that you understand how humans really act, how humans really behave. One thing I will say to any aspiring writer, several things actually, but one thing I would always recommend, if you're going to write, and this is true for fiction or nonfiction, when you go to the coffee shop, like, put down your phone. When you're on a bus or when you're on a plane, look around, or in an airport. That's a good place. See how people behave, see how people interact, see when you see a couple and you can tell their relationship is falling apart. And why can you tell these things? Because of body language, because of maybe their cadence, maybe the way they do or do not hold hands, or see how people treat, their parents, or how parents treat their kids, how the angry person on the cell phone also ordering food at the restaurant, or whatever, the person who's mean to the waiter or waitress. I think understanding how humans act, I don't want to sound like an anthropologist here, but understanding how people behave is an important part of the job, because when you put it on the page, it might make perfect sense, the things that you're writing. But I think the reader, particularly a sophisticated reader, is going to read your work and say, no, that wouldn't have happened. And they might not know that they're feeling that way, but some part of their brain will. It's kind of like when you watch a movie and you can tell when suddenly a scene is 3D computer generated. Some part of your mind, even though the quality of the video is extraordinary, some part of your mind knows, Spider-Man didn't do that. That's a computer, and you're taken out of it for a moment. So when it comes to an education, getting to know how people behave is an important thing. And that just takes time. It just takes sort of a sensitivity and a willingness to sort of be vulnerable, to watch people, and to be empathetic, to put yourself in their shoes and see where they came from. And that's one place where a university education is very important, because you're going to meet a lot of people and you're going to do a lot of cool things, and you're going to see people behave in ways that they wouldn't necessarily have behaved when they were, say, 15 or 12 or 40 for that matter. In terms of what you major in, so my undergraduate degree is in computer science. And the reason is because I thought that I was going to write software for a living when I went to school. And as it turned out, I'm actually quite bad at writing software. So we've all been spared a lifetime of crashing computers because I chose a different field in life. But that was actually a useful degree, and it would come in handy when I was like when I was writing the last book, for example, because computer science is it depends on the university that you go to, but it's usually part of a basic sciences curriculum. So you're going to have to take biology, you're going to have to take geology or physics or any number of sciences, certainly a lot of mathematics. So it was useful to me in learning how to take a sophisticated problem or a complex problem and breaking it down into constituent parts and solving the little problems in order to solve the whole thing, right? So anytime you do a project, you don't actually do a project, you do a series of small steps that when you are finished with the final step, a project has been done. And writing a book is very much like that. So computer science definitely teaches you how to do that. I'm not telling would-be writers to major in computer science. I think probably an English literature degree would be a lot more useful, maybe a journalism degree. I don't know. I don't have any formal journalism training. But to be a writer, you have to be a reader. Like that's just the one thing that you can't get away from. You might be able to fake everything else, but if you're not a reader and you don't come to understand how literature works, what makes a sentence profound or moving, what makes a paragraph look like a paragraph. There's something about the visual structure of words on printed words on a page that feel right to you. And to sort of develop an understanding or an appreciation for just the sheer beauty of words on paper. You got to read a lot of words, but you also have to see how other writers did it, how better writers did it, right? I encourage every author or would-be author to read as much Shakespeare as possible, because there's nothing you will ever write in your career, ever, that Shakespeare didn't get to first. He got there for everything. So, and that's liberating in a way, because suddenly you don't have to worry so much. Like whatever you're writing, it's been done. It was done 550 years ago, and it was done way better than you're going to do it. So just go for it. But you can also, of course, you can read something like Shakespeare or Melville, any number of authors who were good, like inspirational or influential in my own work. You read these authors and you really come to, I would say, you would see how they treat, how they understand, how they convey the human condition in ways that, sublime and profound. I ended up, so that was my undergraduate degree. Years later, I would get a graduate degree, a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. That's essentially a literature degree, but it also has writing workshops in there. So all of the students in the class, or classes plural, would, whatever the topic is. So I was writing short fiction or chapters in a book for my thesis. You're writing this stuff and you bring it to the workshop, which is just a bunch of chairs in a circle. And everybody reads everybody else's stuff in advance and takes notes in the margins. And everyone gives sort of brutally honest feedback on the things that you've written. And that's something that's hard to come by early in your career, or when you know, if you're 16 and you say, I want to be a writer when I grow up, or, well, I mean, you're practically grown up, but you know what I mean. When you're starting out, everyone's natural instinct is to be incredibly supportive, because it's a hard job. I mean, you're basically going to be an artist for a living, right? And there's a reason why a starving artist is a cliche, like, because it's really, really true. And so people, I think in general, you'll encounter one of two people. You'll either encounter people who are overly supportive. Oh, that thing you wrote is beautiful, it's brilliant, it's a masterpiece, which it probably isn't. Or you will encounter people who like to destroy, right? People feel very insecure when you create for a living, when you take nothing and create something. And I think that applies across the arts, whether it's, if you're a sculptor or a painter, an author, why would you want to do that? Or I would have done it this way, or whatever. People feel very insecure when art is being created around them. And perhaps it's because art might be an inherently destructive act, though that's probably a longer conversation for another day. But the utility of a creative writing workshop is no one is really there to make you feel good about yourself. And so you're going to get probably the first brutally honest feedback of your writing life. And it can be really, really hard. Like, it's really, it is, in part, you're developing, I would say you're developing a sort of an armor that you're going to need for the rest of your career, because to be a writer is to be rejected for a living. You're going to write something and you're going to fail yourself, because whatever you're imagining in your head, whether if you're writing fiction and you have this fantasy world that you've envisioned, and you're finally going to put it on the page, it's not going to live up to what was in your head. If you're trying to write a perfect essay, it's just the arguments are not going to come, the sentences are not going to look the way it feels in here. So you're going to disappoint yourself. You're going to basically reject your own writing. Every writer hates their own stuff, I find, or every good writer does anyway. But then you're going to start, sending it to editors, regardless if you're fiction or nonfiction. You're going to say, hey, if it's nonfiction, hey, here is an idea that I have for a story. What do you think? And they're going to say no. And that's it. It's over. Or if you wrote fiction, you're going to send it to, and that's mostly in journalism. And if you're writing for like literary magazines and you write creative nonfiction and submit it, or essays, you would have it composed in advance. But the situation is the same. If you write fiction, you send it to the literary journal and they say, no, thank you. You get a nice no. Like that's a great day. It's like, oh, they rejected it, but they did it nicely, which should also suggest to you that a great many people don't even bother with doing it nicely. I think very early in my career, the worst rejection that I ever got, it was all done by mail in those days. And this is only 15 years ago, but things have changed so much since then in publishing. I'd sent my manuscript to someone, and the first letter, you get a letter back in the mail and it says, I don't know why you bothered sending this to me. I was like, okay, that's a bad day. But it makes for a nice anecdote now, and I'm way more successful than that guy is, so I feel better about things. So an MFA, for example, is a valuable degree to get if this is something that you're serious about, because you're also going to be exposed to literature that you wouldn't otherwise pick up. It's very easy to go to the library and get Harry Potter or whatever. I just read Game of Thrones. That's why I keep thinking Game of Thrones. It's very easy to pick these books up because everybody reads them. It's part of our sort of common cultural vocabulary. But it's not necessarily so easy to go pick up Moby Dick, right? That takes a little more it's just not something that one naturally gravitates toward. But once you're exposed to it, I mean, Moby Dick, it could be an MFA in and of itself. Like if you can make it cover to cover, you'll be a fine writer. You're good to go, because everything you're going to do in terms of as a matter of certainly American literature, much like Shakespeare, got to everything first. And Melville was very well aware that Shakespeare's enormous influence on Moby Dick, but Melville got there first in American literature. So an MFA will expose you to literature you wouldn't otherwise read. And a lot of it's going to be boring. A lot of it might be pedantic. A lot of it might be exhausting. And a lot of it might be great. And what's kind of cool is when you're reading this stuff, these people are like on pedestals. But once you actually build a career, they're going to be your peers and colleagues and people that you email and talk to all the time. So it's kind of neat. But that's a very long way of answering probably a 5-word question, which is you don't need any formal education, but it can help an awful lot. So there was a time in my life when I didn't know that you could actually do this for a living. I mean, it would be like saying that I want to be an astronaut, right? I mean, that's a job that people do. But I mean, who really says I want to be an astronaut and then goes become an astronaut? Like that doesn't really happen. And I kind of looked at writing the same way. It was just outside of my universe. I grew up in a small town in Louisiana. It wasn't like, literature was sort of suffused my life as a child. I was an avid reader and I loved writing. I was in the Army in a past life, many years ago. And in my downtime in Afghanistan, I actually started writing as a way to decompress. And, I mean, we all have a story we'd like to tell. I wasn't writing about the war or anything, but, I had this little science fiction story that I wanted to tell. And it was pretty good. Like I thought, maybe I can do this. And so I came back and I spent a couple of years polishing that manuscript off. It was eventually published by a small press. There wasn't a lot of money involved. I don't remember. It's probably pennies involved, come to think of it. But it was great because it was certainly validation, which was probably more important than anything else. And but again, I came to this problem of, well, how do you make money doing this? Because I think every writer or would-be writer needs to understand that starting out in your career, there's not a lot of that. There's just not a lot of money, which is one reason why like a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing is useful, because you have, 2 or 3 years where all you get to do is write, right? I mean, you might have a day job or whatever, or an evening job, but you do have a block of time where you are going to create a lot of output. Some of it might actually be pretty good. And if nothing else, you'll learn to sit in front of a computer screen and learn the discipline to actually produce prose or poetry. So in my case, that's when I sort of came to freelance writing. Like I went to a conference, actually. It was it wasn't local, it was elsewhere in the state, a sort of a creative writing conference from a small writers group. And they had some great speakers. And one of them worked for Boys Life magazine, which I don't know if it even exists anymore. It's like the official magazine of the Boy Scouts, I think. And I remember that magazine from when I was a kid. So it was kind of cool. And so I pitched a piece and I got a yes. And then one thing that's important in writing is getting FaceTime with people. And I met her and she remembered, and that helps. That goes a long way. People see, well, this person was serious enough to show up for a conference. Maybe they're serious enough to write 300 words or whatever it was. It was a very small story, but again, it was good money. Like it was great. And again, it was validation, but it was also a writing credit, right? Suddenly I could say in any future pieces that I pitched, I have been published nationally in this magazine, and I've written this novel that was published by a small press. And slowly but surely, you're sort of branching out. I think right now is a golden age for would-be writers, because there are so many outlets that'll publish just about anything, to be honest with you. I mean, there's pretty bad stuff out there. But the corollary of that is you're, even though your stuff might be not yet, you haven't matured as a writer, you do have places that will actually take your work. So, but starting out, you know, it was the days of old, and you wrote, you pitched stories on us with on a typewritten page with self-addressed stamped envelope, and you sent it off and all that stuff. But I was very fortunate. I started writing for The Atlantic very early on in my career. Mark Ambender was the political editor there at the time, and he and I struck up a friendship on social media, and he asked me to write a piece for them. And eventually, and this touches on something I'd mentioned earlier about, you know, when you're 19, I wasn't 19 at the time, I was much older than that, but when you're 19, you have no life experience. Like, you don't have anything to say. Like, you just, there's a reason why everyone's first novel tends to be really, you know, could be, or serious first novels tend to be pretty good. And everyone's second novel is usually pretty bad because they used all the good stuff up. You're 20, like, what have you done? Like, it was all on the first one. There's nothing left for the second. Anyhow, but I had life experience, right? So I was in Afghanistan. So I was able to write about that. And that was a great writing credit. Like, suddenly when you have The Atlantic on your pitch letter for future places, people will take you a little more seriously. I don't know that that's the case anymore, but certainly at the time it was. Anyhow, it slowly dawned on me that I could actually do this for a living, and where I could pay my bills, right? Pay my daughter's preschool fees or whatever. Eventually I just went for it. Like, I went all in, and I was fortunate. I was fortunate, and it's funny though. So almost 15 years now, I've been doing it, and every month when I pay my rent and pay the electric bill, pay my car note or whatever, I feel like I fooled them again. I got away with it one more time. And that's never stopped. That's never not been the feeling that I've had. So I'm very fortunate to have that job that I have, and it's also very humbling. I mean, I work all the time. I work 7 days a week, and I love my job though. So it doesn't feel like work. It just feels more like, I don't know, putting on a comfortable pair of gloves. So, yeah, so that's how I came to it, and hopefully I'll fool them again next month. Writing is a profoundly lonely profession. You have to be very comfortable with yourself. You have to be very comfortable with disappointing yourself. I think there's a reason why writers drink themselves into an early grave. It can be you have to live inside yourself. You have to feel very deeply. If you're doing this seriously, like, you could write for, you know, some website and make $40,000 a year, and, you know, never tax your brain once in your entire career. But if you're going to do this for real, and you're going to write things that you want people to pick up and say, oh, this was pretty good. I now think differently about either the subject or this emotion, or even the very structure of the genre itself. You're going to spend a lot of time in here. That's one reason why I write from coffee shops, weirdly, because it's enough people around where I feel like I'm in a social setting, I am in a social setting, but it's impersonal enough where you're not being distracted, or, you know, it's like a bar, for example, or a busy restaurant. When I'm reporting these things out, when I'm actually in the field, when I'm meeting new people, or like Antarctica is an example, right? So I had to go on an expedition to Antarctica so that I would have a better understanding of what these researchers in Antarctica do to study climate change. So I spent a month there, and you get to know you get to know people when there are 25 people around you and no one else for 900 miles in any direction. So in those cases, it can be, you're going to meet a lot of people. I tend also to go to a lot of conferences on whatever I'm writing about, which is a very social thing. So I'm fortunate in one way. So I'm a social person. Like I can engage with just about anyone, and I'm really good at listening. So people tend to talk more when somebody is going to sit there and actually pay attention to them. So I tend to be around more people than a lot of my colleagues. And I tend to build a lot of friendships. And I live in New Orleans, which is like one of the 3 great literary cities in the world. So there is just sort of an understanding, I think, between the artist and between the public here that I find very enchanting and very, very moving. People take art very seriously here. But overall, I would say, particularly when you're starting out, if you want a job where you're going to be with a lot of people and interact all the time and have a witty repartee, like writing is not for you. It's lonely and it can be alienating, but I think if you stick it out, you'll find that it's worth it. So my Army, actually before I was in the Army, I was in the Air Force. So I really kind of checked a lot of boxes there. But the experience in terms of the people that you meet is similar. I can't say that I would encourage anyone to join the military. I mean, that's fine if you do, and certainly a path that I went down. But depending on what your goals are in life, it may not be the fastest avenue to achieve them. Sometimes it can be, but sometimes, let's face it. So the guy I bought my car from at the dealership was former Army Special Forces. Like, there's not a lot of Army Special Forces type jobs you can do outside of the Army. And so he's selling cars now, and he's doing a fine job. And I'm sure he was a great soldier. The Army experience, it is a wonderful way, a deeply wonderful way, in fact, to meet people of backgrounds that you would absolutely not otherwise meet. I can say that with absolute metaphysical certainty. And you come to appreciate. All right, so let's face it. So you go to college, right? So I was enlisted. I wasn't even an officer in the Army, but you go to college and after high school, and everyone that you are around is, would be scholar or intellectual in some way. It's not the universal case, but it is the case that you will be around people who are like seriously about building their education and studying weird and abstruse topics. Real life is not necessarily that. That's not normal. People don't generally do that. Some people they want to work at the factory. They want to punch out at 5. They want to watch TV, get a beer with the friends, on the weekend, go get in their bass boat and go speeding around the water. And that's a great life. And 2 kids, spouse, picket fence, all that stuff. It's great. Dog. The life that you imagine when you're a child and you have to draw a house that's just a square with a rectangle on top with a little chimney. That's a fine life. But we all, both in terms of where we grew up, you're very hyper localized, generally speaking. If you're like in New York City right now, your experience is going to be different. But I grew up in rural America. So the people that you grew up with are going to be the same people from kindergarten through 12th grade. And you're going to meet this tiny little circle in a giant ocean, or a tiny drop of water in an ocean of people. And you're going to think the whole world revolves around that little town and those little people. When you go to college, you're going to meet people from a more diverse background who came from perhaps depending on where you go to university, all over the country and maybe all over the world, but still everybody's going to have that same mindset, right? I got to pass the next test. I've got to get to the next level. I've got to graduate, and then I've got to do some nice white collar job or this intellectual pursuit. And then you're going to graduate college, and then you're going to work at your company. And when you're at your company, you're going to meet everyone again who's going to have a similar background to you, or certainly a similar understanding of the world, because you're working at this office, or you're an accountant, or you are whatever. Even if you decide you want to be a plumber or a ditch digger, or whatever you want to do, generally speaking, your universe is going to be very small. And it's very difficult to break out of that small universe to the point where you do believe this is how all people are everywhere. And the Army is a great way to meet people that absolutely came from everywhere and have motivations and backgrounds and appreciations of things that you would not have, and that you would not even be exposed to. The kind of people that you see on TV and you say, how could someone think like that? Well, it's because they came from a different background than you. That's how. And their life experience is just as valid as yours. And in fact, what's going on in their universe, in their head, their infinite mind, right, is as profound and meaningful and uplifting and spiritual as what's going on in your own head, their own universe. And you will encounter people, who have totally different life experiences. From that point of view, for me, it was a valuable experience as a writer, because and I met some of the smartest people I've ever encountered in my entire life. I can think of 3 people right now that are geniuses, but didn't even graduate high school. But they are geniuses. I mean, I have no doubt, to the point where I would meet them and it was almost breathtaking how smart they were, and how you're afraid to say anything because you don't want to embarrass yourself, because they have that sort of intellect. I also met some idiots, but that's again is good. It's good to meet people who, again, aren't you. So my Army experience was, I would say, it was all about the people. Even when I was in Afghanistan, my favorite part, I loved the Afghans more than I loved the Americans there. It was great. They were wonderful people. So when I think back on it, so I got out in 2008. When I think back on it, the only thing I remember are the people, really. Everything else is like I've got pictures, but those things don't stand out. It's the pictures of the people that tend to be the thing I think about most. That experience gave me the opportunity or the time to actually write. So, and my first sort of big break in freelance writing was a direct result of having been in Afghanistan. So it was enormously empowering for my career. It created my career. It gave me sort of that sky crane to create a career from nothing. I mean, I saw some neat things, and I saw countries that you ordinarily just see on TV. In fact, that's why I enlisted in the first place. I enlisted in 2002. 9/11 had happened a few months earlier. And my thought was, I don't know, I just kind of want to see it. I could spend I didn't imagine it'd be 20 years, but I could spend the next X number of years watching this thing happen on TV, or maybe I could just go there. Maybe that would be kind of neat. And so that was my motivation. It wasn't really like a flag waving thing or I'm going to go save the world kind of thing. It was just like, I don't know that I can sit this one out. I just want to see it with my own eyes. And I mean, I think I don't know that it's changed. It changed me as a person in terms of having that sense of, not tenacity, that's not the right word, but certainly ambition or desire to have these giant experiences. I think they just went together. And also, I mean, I grew up poor, so it was really great because I had a way to go to college, go to graduate school for free. And it paid back some of my undergraduate expenses. Again, I wouldn't encourage anyone to do this for the college money, but that's not a bad reason to do it. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And it's also a great way to escape your social situation if you are not well off. Like if you're not middle class, it's hard to get into middle class. The army is a lovely way to sort of pole vault into that next social strata, right? Um, so from all of those points of view, it was incredibly beneficial. And I don't know that I could actually trace my life forward without having had that experience. That's an interesting question to think about in terms of writing, because I've met a lot of very successful writers who are not very social, or who blend in perfectly in the room, where you never even notice them, and then you find out later you were there at the same time. I've encountered a lot of writers who are like, as soon as they walk in, it's like, oh, well, that person, he's definitely, or she's definitely a writer. We just have a type. Hemingway once said that, I mean, to be a successful writer, right, no matter what you did the night before, you've got to wake up in the morning and bite on the nail. And I think that's a good way of characterizing the job, because you don't know, very few people wake up, spring out of bed, and feel inspired to write. It's not like that. It's more slow and a slow dance with yourself, or a slow arm wrestling match with yourself might also be apt. And John Grisham, of all writers, once said that, write a page a day or you're not serious. And I find that kind of funny, because I probably write 1,000 publishable words a day. Like, I'm always working. But for when you're starting out, you're not. And that's actually good advice. Like, just write a page. If you can do that, you will have gone far. So the writers that I tend to see who don't endure, or are somehow fail in their profession and go to another one, or who, I mean, a lot of writers, have a day job doing something else. I don't. This is all I do. But a lot of writers do, and I don't consider them failed writers. They just are doing their career differently from me. But I would certainly say that it requires kind of a hustler mentality. Like, you're always, if you're doing freelance writing, you're always chasing down, the next place that's going to publish you. If you're writing a book, you're always working on that book. Philip Roth was once asked how, because he had an output of like 50 books or something in his career. And someone asked him, like, how long do you go between, writing books? And he said, psychologically, 3 minutes. And there's a lot of truth to that. Another unappreciated skill that you need to be a successful writer, in terms of making your living creating word or putting words on the page, you've got to treat your career in a lot of ways like a small business. I mean, you've got to do invoicing. You've got to, you've got to chase down money. You'd be surprised how many enormous publications just take 6 months to pay you. And so you're constantly sort of having to hound them, and you're having to not alienate them at the same time, because you want to do more work for them in the future. So you've got to learn how to sort of handle people, or how to interact with people on a professional, on a business level, or on a corporate level, in a sense. You've got to budget your life, and you've got to figure out, is there more money coming in than there is going out? I mean, this is like budgeting 101, but the difference is, if I worked at a restaurant, or if I worked at a hospital, or if I worked at a factory, like, I know from 9 to 5, I'm going to do this. And then in 2 weeks, I'm going to get a paycheck. And then from 9 to 5, the following 2 weeks, I'll work every day, and then I get a paycheck. And that is not the case in this job. Like, it just is not. So you're always trying to make sure that a paycheck is coming in. And so I try to keep a certain amount of money always invoiced out. And I found that to be a successful strategy for doing it. But yeah, so business skills are also very valuable if you're going to do this, to the point where you're going to have like you're going to have an LLC, a limited liability corporation, for your business structure, because you're going to have tax write-offs, and you're going to have to handle all that kind of thing. So this is a weird skill set, right? So I'm telling you to have an artist's eye. I'm telling you to be in, have the discipline of a bodybuilder, and also the mind of an accountant. Like, these are not skill sets that usually come together, and certainly not skill sets that come together to produce what you hope are enduring works of literature. But I mean, when we read about, I mean, again, I'll bring Shakespeare back into this. He was doing the same thing. Like, he worked really hard, and he wasn't even doing it to be remembered. That's just a quirk of history that we remember that he existed and that his stuff was saved. So, but he was a businessman. So you have to have all of those different things come together, and you can tell right away when somebody just isn't going to bring all of those things to the table, just through interaction. So it's not an easy job, but it is enormously rewarding. The stuff that I write will exist in libraries for 100 years, and that's kind of neat, because I won't be here for 100 years, but some part of me will be. So. You need a laptop, you need Microsoft Word, and the sky's the limit after that. When you're, find a dictionary that you like. I like the Merriam-Webster Collegiate 13th edition. Find a place that you like to work, a place where you can close a door if you need to, in order to sort of go into your mind palace, right? To sort of dig deep, to go into the paragraph mines and start chiseling out words and chunks of paragraph. But that's really all you need. A library card, I would also find very, very useful. But the cost of entry for this job is very low. You don't even need a computer, come to think of it. But once you start writing for publications, Microsoft Word, in book publishing, Microsoft Word is the only software. It's sort of the lingua franca, right? It's the only thing that anyone uses in freelance writing. Like, a lot of surprising publications tend to use Google Docs. So the New York Times uses Google Docs, for example. I think Google Docs is awful. I wrote an entire book in Google Docs, so I do have enough experience to know when something's awful. But there again, I mean, that's free. It's free to access. So some word processor, some computer to type it on. If you can't afford a computer, if you can't afford a word processor, they have that at the library. And there again, that library card comes in handy. And because in order to be a writer, you have to be a reader, again, you're going to want to browse the stacks and get out of your comfort zone. So those are the only things that one really needs. It's all I needed anyway, but it remains to be seen if that'll last me for the rest of my career. I would say overall, probably not. Some bad advice that people give is write what you know. And particularly if you're writing fiction, you probably don't know any wizards or dragons or spaceships. You should probably know people, as we discussed previously, but you don't need to travel. I mean, I could probably get by the rest of my career without traveling. I think that the quality of work would plummet if I did. I think that you come away with a new appreciation for how things work. If you're writing nonfiction or if you're doing journalism, by far, what's more valuable than going to the press conference is what's going on in the hallway outside the press conference, where the people who actually are in charge are talking, right? Or when you encounter the person who's angry about something, who just wants a moment to vent. So travel is very valuable from that point of view. And it's also valuable from a networking perspective, right? It's good to know other writers. It's good to know editors. It's good to know the people that you are writing about. And this is true in fiction. So if you were going to write a book about professional Scrabble players, right? It's probably useful to go to a Scrabble conference and see how these people do their thing. What are the mannerisms? What are what's the vernacular that they use? What are some weird Scrabble words, not in terms of playing on the board, but slang that they use for each other that everyone knows what it is? These sorts of things enough good things can't be said about it. But do you need to do it? I would say you could probably get by without it, but you would be a lesser writer for that. At a certain age, there are only successful writers and people who do something else. Like, um, so I do very well for myself, and it's been very hard to get to this place. But I would say one can pretty easily reach six figures. Not pretty easily. I mean, it takes a lot of work, but you can expect to achieve that in your career if you're dogged about it, and if you put in the work, and are willing to sort of deal with the setbacks. When you're starting out, you're not going to make that. I mean, there are exceptions, but there's a reason why you hear about the 22-year-old who just got the $6 million book deal, because that's an anomaly. Most people are mid-list or less. I think the average advance for a book is something like $5,000. So that's very hard when you're early in your career. Now, when you're later in your career, you get a lot of money, and that's great, because one thing that you've demonstrated over the course of several years is I am able to think through a project from beginning to end. I'm able to deliver on this project, and I'm able to do so in a way that is engaging and in some way artistic, I hope, and perhaps worth the reader's time. There was a time when, I would write for 10 cents a word. So 1,000 words is, $100. And those were great days. Like, that was, wow, I'm being paid money to do this. And I do a lot better than that now. And actually, it's strange. So sometimes I think back when my career first started, I had to produce such an incredible volume of output as a freelance writer, in order to make a living. I mean, just thousands upon thousands of words a day, and I don't remember any of them. I mean, and it was probably all garbage. Like, a lot of it was just words for dollars. Like, I wasn't out there writing Shakespeare. It was just, top 10 list of whatever pumpkins that look like presidents or whatever, and these kind of things you run across on the internet. It's funny. So the last time I was in Paris, I was at the Louvre, and I was like, what are some other things that I want to make sure that I see? And I pulled up some article, and like, suddenly this story that I know somebody wrote for $50 is like driving my trip to the museum. So it's interesting that you're touching people's lives in that way. But when you're first starting out, you're so busy that you don't have time to think about just how poor you are and just how hard it is to actually do what you're doing. It's like walking a tightrope that you don't even realize you're walking. It's only when you're on the other side that you realize, oh, that was a tightrope, and there were sharks down there and machine gun nests. Like, it's a pretty scary thing. Now it's scary in a different way, because now, for me, I want to make sure that the work that I'm doing is good. It's of high quality, and again, worth the reader's time. And when you start getting large paying contracts, you actually have to deliver. Like, it's not enough to get the contract. That's good. But then turning in something that's worth the money. If somebody's paying you $10,000 to do something, you actually have to put in $10,000 of work. Like, you gotta deliver it, and that itself is scary. But to answer the question more, generally, I would say that you can, if you stick with it, and if you're good at your job, you can in 2021 dollars make six figures pretty easily as a freelance writer. Staff writers tend to make, I don't know, after about 10 years, I would say maybe staff writers are making in there maybe 70,000, somewhere in that area. But they also get health insurance and things like that. So there are benefits that I don't necessarily get. But I also get total freedom, and I can do whatever I want, when I want to do it, where I want to do it. So, and that's priceless. So. There are two stigmas that come to mind immediately. One is social and one is professional. The social stigma is if you say, I'm a writer, one of two things happen. One, and this tends to be the main thing that people do, is immediately think, he's poor. And he actually works at a restaurant. He works at Whole Foods, right? And he writes, right? That's a thing that people tend to think. But then you feel pretentious because you can't say, no, I'm a real writer. Like here's my checkbook. Like, let me show you. So you're kind of in a trap there, right? There's no right way to say, no, I'm not like the fraud down the road that your cousin who self-published some book when he was, 30. Like that is a weird stigma to overcome. Like, you don't put it on your dating profile. The other social response is sometimes like eyes get wide and people say, really? And then you gotta like, yeah. And then the next thing they say is, I've always wanted to write a book, but I just haven't had time. And I find that so offensive because like, my life's work is like your hobby, what you would imagine like your hobby to be. Like, you would do my job if you just had more time. That's like me saying, heart surgeon, I was going to do that, but I'm so damn busy, I can't do what you do. So that is one thing that you encounter. So that's socially. Professionally, this is a real problem, I think. People's understanding of journalists is colored heavily by what they've seen on TV or bad interactions they've had in the past. What you've seen on TV is like the dogged investigative reporter who's going to get down to the truth of the problem and who's going to dig deep and keep finding the wrongdoing and all that stuff, or who's going to be a real jerk about it, or just going to be, somehow arrogant or entitled to your business. And so people are very guarded around journalists because people are also aware that if a journalist does a bad job, let's say, so my last book was about space. So in the space program, if I quote somebody badly or I misrepresent the work that they're doing, their $3 billion mission might get canceled. Like there's a lot at stake that people have a lot at stake when they talk to a journalist. And particularly scientists, I find, but I think this would apply to any profession, get nervous because there's a lot of nuance to what everybody does. It doesn't matter what your job is. There's a guy working on telephone poles outside my window right now. If you are the telephone pole guy doing the thing in the whatever it is, there's nuance to that I don't appreciate. I just see him in the little bucket thing. And if I had to explain his job to someone else, I would do a bad job of it. Even if we had a nice long chat about it, I would still do a bad job of explaining it. It takes more work than that. So people who have to talk to the press in those sorts of jobs have frequently been burned by people who did a poor job, or they've been quoted poorly. And if you're a scientist, when saying the word a something versus the something is night and day, right? People are hesitant to engage you, or you have to work hard to prove that, no, I'm actually going to do a good job. And scientists are also weird because like you could say, the sky is blue and they'd say, well, technically, but people want that, well, technically in there. Nobody wants to just say the sky is blue, the grass is green, mountains are brown, trees have leaves like that. So the professional stigma is the novice journalist who messes it up for the people who are serious about it. Not maliciously, but I was that person at some point, I'm sure. But it's also important, and this goes back to talking about social skills that we had earlier. I think it's important when you're interacting with people, because my job is literally to go up to someone essentially and say, so what's going on here? Like, tell me more about that. And, you have to do it with some finesse, right? So those are two stigmas that I can think of. He really works at Whole Foods, and he's nothing wrong with working at Whole Foods, but that's what he does, and he's poor, or he's out to destroy my career by publishing the wrong thing. So it's hard to operate in those parameters, but it can be done. What I find most rewarding about my job is when it's just me and Microsoft Word, right? And I find a way to write something in an interesting way. I'm trying to make a contribution to literature. And a lot of what my job is similar to the sculptor, right? I'm looking at the giant chunk of rock and I've got to carve away everything that doesn't look like a lion. And it's slow and it's painful and it's exhausting. But when you do it right, when you write that one great sentence, there's a rewarding sensation that you get that it's hard to match. Stephen King had a great quote a few years ago because someone had said something like, his last couple of books weren't great. And he responded something to the effect of, well, they're not all great, but they all have some great things in there. And he was speaking from the heart from that, because those great things that you do really do resonate in a way that sort of financial gain or professional advancement doesn't give you. I love that I get to meet cool people. Like if I'm writing a book about the exploration of Europa, which is the ocean moon of Jupiter, right? I can call the person at NASA who's in charge of the mission to Europa, right? If I want to write, one reason that I got into space, so as I mentioned earlier, when I first started out as a freelance writer, I wrote for a political editor, and I covered politics and foreign policy and war and stuff like that. And I hated my job. Like, I found it depressing and exhausting. And all the people I was writing about were terrible people doing terrible things all the time. And one morning I just woke up and I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I mentioned the space robots earlier. Again, I like space. I like robots. I'm going to write about space robots. That's what I'm going to do. And that's going to bring me great joy and pleasure. And it did. So one of the biggest things that I'd covered early in my career was, if you'll recall, before 2015, Pluto, nobody knew what that planet looked like, right? It was just like, I don't know, artist rendition, an orange blob with ice caps or something. Nobody knew. And I wanted to be there when the spacecraft flew by, like it's called a spacecraft encounter. Because I knew from research that, like, mission to, and I know this is a very circular way of getting to it, but there's a point to this. So in 2015, the New Horizons spacecraft went to Pluto, and for the first time, we see this image of a new planet that's always been part of our lives, but is now real. Like, this is for real. This is a thing that exists in the world. It's an ontological reality. But the rocket didn't launch like the week before, right? The rocket had launched a decade before. That's how far away Pluto was. And before that, decades of work went into developing that mission. That mission started in the 1980s, and we only saw the result of these people's work in 2015. And suddenly this thing that didn't exist except in our imaginations existed for real as a photograph that we could share. And I wanted to be there for that moment. So that's one of the motivations to really cultivate a serious career covering space. I'd written about it before then, but at that point, that was like a real motivator. And concurrently, I was working on a book, but it was the ability to see things that people don't ordinarily get to see, and to be accepted for seeing them. Like, I didn't have to break into the building, right? I didn't have to dodge the cops. I'm just suddenly in the room with people doing these amazing things, and everyone's just kind of like, yeah, that's perfectly normal. Which it's not for me. In my head all the time when I'm doing these things, I'm like screaming, this is the coolest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Like, how lucky am I? Or like, I'm an imposter, right? Like, they're going to figure me out at any moment. Um, but it's deeply rewarding to um, be able to meet people who are sort of at the top of their field, or conversely, it's really rewarding to meet people who are at the bottom of their field, right? Um, the guy who moves the box of parts around the warehouse at the NASA facility, right? Like, he's moving spaceship parts. Like, how cool is that? So it's very nice to be able to, and unlike somebody who's actually in that industry, whatever industry it is, I get to step back and have a holistic view of things, and I get to tell other people about it. That's my job. I go look at things and tell people about it. And I don't know any other job where that's where you get to do that. Um, so these are intangibles, but I think that anyone who does this long enough or does this seriously will find great joy in that, both the words that you've created and the experiences that you've lived. The hard part, I would say, is every day you start at zero. Like, every day that page is blank, particularly for journalism. Like, you don't start out with 500 standard words. There's nothing. You file new in Microsoft Word, and then you got to create something from nothing. And it can be very draining spiritually and emotionally, because again, you're trying to in some way create art, and you have to fight it sometimes. So that's a real, that can be a stressor, having to deliver quality prose. Um, I guess every job has that in some form, but that is what I experience in mine. The other thing is, you start at 0 words, but you also start with no story that has been bought by somebody. So you're having to sell yourself, like sell your career every day. There are people that I write for regularly, and sort of a stable of editors that I have worked with over the years, and that touches on what I'd said earlier about, the later you are in your career, the more successful you're going to be, simply because you know more people, you know more places to sell this stuff. And if you don't, like, I don't know how this career could be done otherwise. It's anything's possible, but I don't know how I could personally do it. So yeah, you got to sell, you got to come up with ideas for the stories that when you read a magazine or a website, like, somebody had to think of, I'm going to cover this thing. And there's not always a thing. Sometimes I'm going to write about this thing that has no connection to reality. I'm going to write about the history of Hoover Dam, and here's why you should care. Like, where does that come from? It came from desperation, probably. Like, I got to come up with something and sell it right now because I got to pay the water bill. But so that aspect is very, very stressful, because that has nothing to do with your talent or ability. Sometimes it has to do with, the state of the industry, and publishing is feast or famine. Like, for example, so publishing, freelance, or like journalism is advertiser driven. That is where newspapers, magazines, websites get their money. Even the ones that you pay for a subscription, that subscription is not what pays their rent. Theirs is advertising. So when COVID hit, suddenly, when economic times get bad, what is the first thing that every company cuts in their budget? The first thing they cut is advertising, because that money can be utilized elsewhere that can actually make more money. So when COVID hit and the quarantine started, and 200 years ago, immediately, like, I lost $25,000 overnight. Like, it was just gone. Like, it disappeared, because all those contracts vanished immediately. And that was those pieces that I'd sold vanished immediately. And that was very, very scary, because it was very obvious at the time, and it remains obvious, sadly, that this quarantine wasn't going to end. The economy wasn't going to come roaring out of this thing. We're going to limp out of it. And I was very afraid that, my career might not be able to sustain it. And I have no other skills. So I guess I was going to be working at Whole Foods and everyone was going to be right. Again, nothing against people who work at Whole Foods. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. I was wrong in the end, like that. So that's what happened immediately. But publishing actually recovered very nicely, because one thing that nobody was thinking was that, well, everyone's going to be stuck at home. All they're going to do all day is read. No one expected people to start reading books, for example, but they did. Like, publishing was booming during this time. So that uncertainty is certainly a stressor. But I don't know how other writers have fared. I know some who are basically out of the business. I'm just going to do something else. I'll go in advertising, because I'll just be on the other side of the same magazine page, and a guaranteed income. But I was able to fare well during it. But yeah, so that's pretty frustrating. 0 words and $0. That's where you always start out every day, and it gets easier, but it doesn't get less scary. So I didn't know any writers when I started, and I didn't go to school for it initially. The success that I've had in my career is entirely because I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And to that end, my ignorance has been a great asset to me. When I wrote my last book, which again, 7 years to write a book, it's a long time. If I had known how difficult it was going to be, I never would have done it. But having done it, it was a very well received book, and I'm very proud of it. So yeah, I think this is one of those careers where you just need to embrace the uncertainty, and never, I don't want to be Han Solo here, but you don't want to know the odds, right? You just don't want to know how hard this job is, and you don't want to know your likelihood of failure, and you don't want to know your limits. And if you can make peace with that sort of sense of profound ignorance, I think you can do very well. I certainly did, but who knows? This might be my last day on the job. We'll see. I have a very poor work-life balance, which is to say that it doesn't exist. And that's probably not a good thing. So do better than me. Like, don't be like me, kids. No. I'm working or thinking about work all the time. And every experience, some part of you is like, how can I mine this for money later, right? How can I get some words out of this? So I will say, what is interesting is that there are experiences that I might have had 25 years ago that suddenly, out of nowhere, manifest in some paragraph that I write for some story that I never would have expected. Certainly, I didn't think I was be a writer then, but those moments, those experiences became very valuable to me in the present day. That's probably an elegant way to answer the question, but it's best I can come up with. If you're in school right now, so I'm speaking to college students and high school students, the next time you are assigned to write an essay, ask yourself, do I want to do this every day for the rest of my life? And if the answer is yes, then you're in business. Like, welcome to the greatest career that you could possibly have. If the answer is, I would rather stick my head in a deep fryer, then you should probably look elsewhere, because those those book reports, right? Those essays on whatever, write about mitochondria or sparrows or the history of the textile industry in Uzbekistan. Like that kind of stuff is just what you have to do. And I take great pleasure in that stuff. Like I get to call the guy or the woman in Uzbekistan who's in charge of textiles and say, hey, what's going on here? And then I get to write about it. And I do feel like I get to do it. Like it's a great pleasure and honor. And it's also deeply rewarding that people would entrust their life story and their life's work and sort of their careers and their, this as well as I, and entrust that stuff to me and trust that I'm going to represent it in a respectable way. So, but at the end of the day, no matter how cool the phone call was, no matter how neat the reporting trip was, no matter how cool the rocket launch or the penguins in Antarctica or the, whatever, sailing on the high seas or whatever you go through, at the end of the day, it's you and the word processor, and you still have to write about it. If you like doing it for free in school, you'll love doing it for money. But if you don't, it takes you're still going to be doing it for free for a long time before you start making money. So, so prepare yourself. But it's a cool job.